So here again, looking at these excerpts from Paul Landsberg and also the excerpt from the poem by W.H. Auden, which I'll get to later. This is the other half of the title of the module, this notion of being beyond death as a counter to Heidegger's idea of human existence itself as a being towards death. That's what's important, I think, to register about this idea of a being towards death. That is what Heidegger said human existence is, essentially. It's not just that we happen to be moving towards our own end. That is how we define ourselves. That's so deeply a part of what it means to be a human being that it's definitive of a human being. And Landsberg's Catholic Christian philosophy is really meant to offer an alternative to that, I think. And although he never uses the term being beyond death, I think that it's fair to apply it to him. That is, if we look at ourselves and we ask what we really are, Landsberg does not see a being headed towards its absolute end. Landsberg sees a being headed towards its ultimate fulfillment as a being, and that, in his Catholic philosophy, is only one that can be achieved through death. Death is necessary only insofar as death is the transition of the human person into its fully realized form, which I take to be the Orthodox Christian, the Christian idea of the meaning of death. Not that death isn't a trial, death is the great challenge. And that's what he's getting at in that first excerpt, the first quote that I gave you in the beginning there. The specifically human problem of death is created by the transformation of the living being into person. It's too bad that we don't have time in an accelerated class like this to read Landsberg's essay as a whole. It's very challenging, but it's very, very rewarding. But his central concept is the person. That is, you and I we're animals. We're Homo sapiens. We're members of a species. We're biological creatures. And we share all sorts of things, most of our nature, with the other animals, the other non-human animals. But we are also persons, and that's what makes us different. The idea of the person, that you and I are something beyond. We are something more than animals. We are selves or persons. And it's this personhood that makes death a problem for us, insofar as it's quite natural for a human being to die insofar as they are an animal. But for a person to die, the person to be wiped out, to be annihilated in that Epicurean sense of that theory of death, is a problem. Because as persons, as self-conscious, self-aware beings who realize their own worth and are capable of love, it's not so clear that death is a natural thing. And that's what the second quote really says, when he says that death comes from an alien sphere and is introduced, as it were, from outside our existence. What he's denying is that death is natural for the human person. It may be natural for an animal, but it's not natural for a person. It's an alien force. It's not something that should be simply quietly accepted. It's something that should be resisted. And that's part of the Christian idea of death, is that death is resisted. I mean, Christ is the victor over death. So this denial that we are a being towards death is fleshed out a little bit more in the last excerpt here, where he says the human person is not, in its true essence, an existence towards death. I'm sorry for the typo. Like every other existence after its own fashion, it is a movement towards self-realization and towards eternity. It tends towards its own perfection, even if it means passing through the straight and narrow gate of death. That's why I suggested earlier that while the human person demands to be realized, to be fulfilled, that can only happen through death, through this transformation that occurs in the Christian idea of death. So, and the rest of it is really a dismissal of the alternate idea of death being the absolute end. Where he says the finality of death is only felt as suffering when the act which would have pointed towards survival, and that's the survival of the person through, beyond death and eternity, has been swallowed up in despair. The anguish of death, and not only the pain of dying, would be incomprehensible if the fundamental structure of our being did not include the existential postulate of something beyond. Like there's this notion of the beyond, the survival of the person through death is just so entrenched in our consciousness that we really can't do without it. That's what he's saying. Not just psychologically, but just in our whole way of looking at ourselves. Without this, death would simply be a future fact, painful enough, no doubt, but without any exceptional gravity and without any danger of a metaphysical character. Now that might take some time to unpack what he means by metaphysical there. This very anguish reveals that death and nothingness are opposed to the deepest and most ineradicable tendencies of our being. Pretty amazing thing to claim, and a difficult thing to prove, just as Plato in his Phaedo. It's a very difficult thing to prove that the soul is immortal. It's a very difficult thing to prove for any Christian writer that this hope, as he calls it, this hope of eternal life, eternal realization, self-realization, self-perfection. Very difficult to prove something like that. I think perhaps all you can really do is that idea is just make a claim that that idea is so deeply entrenched in our being as to be something that we need to acknowledge. At the very moment I formulate the thought, I affirm the instinct in the human person to realize and perpetuate itself. At the root of all being, there is an act, the affirmation of the self. So it's really accusing the Heidegger idea of being a denial, a despairing denial of the self, whereas the Christian idea is an affirmation of the self, an affirmation of the self's realization in a beyond. I couldn't help but toss in this excerpt. This is actually about half the poem, I believe, but the best half, I think, of W.H. Auden's Kenzo, and W.H. Auden, 20th century British/American poet. I don't know exactly when this was written, probably around mid-century, mid-20th century. It seemed to capture some of, for me, and poetry helps me when I guess I see connections, and it helps me keep in mind sometimes what philosophical ideas are about. Seemed to capture to me some of that Landsberg's idea of the demand for a beyond, the demand for self-realization. Let me just read it through quickly. We are created from and with the world, to suffer with and from it day by day. Whether we meet in a majestic world of solid measurements or a dream world of swans and gold, we are required to love all homeless objects that require a world. And it's really the next part that I chose it for. Oh, that's quite beautiful. Our claim to own our bodies and our world is our catastrophe. That's about death, right? That's about being invested in the world, to own your body, to own the world, to have that kind of investing in something which is terribly temporary, right? Because we don't own our bodies and we don't own our world. Both will be taken away from us in death. What can we know but panic and caprice until we know our dreadful appetite demands a world? So I think that's the real connection. Our dreadful appetite demands a world. That's Landsberg's idea that the human person demands self-realization. Our dreadful appetite demands a world whose order, origin, and purpose will be fluid satisfaction of our will. I think, at least my take on that last part of it, is that Auden is claiming something very similar to Landsberg, is that human existence itself in its deepest aspect demands a beyond demands something beyond the temporary earthly existence it has now, demands something more, which will be more deeply satisfactory to us than this world we experience now.